So it's Friday, April the 7th, and welcome back to the shop. So basically, we're going to change the gears in the rear end of this 68 Mustang. Now, there are two ways to get at those gears. The first is to remove the entire rear end out of this car, take the entire axle, everything out, and put it on the ground. Now, if this was a Ford 9-inch, I would highly consider that. The Ford 9-inch is a lot heavier, it's a lot harder to get at the bolts because of the way it's designed. But this is a Ford 8-inch, so it's a lot easier to get at, it's a lot lighter. So I'm just going to simply pull the third member, or what we like to call the pumpkin, out of the differential. Now, in order to do that though, I have to do a couple of things first. First things I got to do is I got to pull these wheels, and I got to pull the axle shafts out of this car. The problem is those axle shafts come into the rear end and they connect into the gear clusters or the spider gears of the rear end, which means you can't pull the gears out if the axles are in it. We interrupt your regularly scheduled program for a quick service announcement. I changed this video. Originally, I went through a lot of detail as far as setting backlash, setting the pinion preload, and looking at the gear meshing. And I still do cover it. And I cover it from the perspective of process, what I needed to do, how I needed to get it done. But when it talks about actually how to set the pinion preload and changing the torque on the main pinion nut, I decided that there's 1,000 videos out there that talk about this. I think what's more important to talk about is the end result. So I rebuilt the rear end. I followed all the specs, and again, you can follow this video and you can see those kind of specs, or you can look at other videos. But basically, the end result was I finished putting the rear end together, I put it back in the car, put the car back on the ground, and I took it for a drive. Went about 20 miles, right? Just a nice little loop around our area. I thought, okay, this is working well, the car is behaving nicely. Brought the car back in the garage, and I thought, let me check if there's a leak. Let's face it, right? I just put the rear end back in. Let's make sure there's no leak. I reached underneath, put my hand underneath the pumpkin, and it was scalding hot. Now, scalding hot, what does that mean? Well, that means I couldn't hold my hand on the pumpkin for a second. I mean, as soon as I touched it and my body went, that's hot, I took my hand away. But how hot is hot? Well, the only way to know that is to go out and get one of these. Now, if you have one, great. If you don't have one, Canadian Tire, they're on sale right now. Little laser tells me the temperature of whatever I pointed at. It's a great little tool. So, went out and bought one of these, took the car for another drive the next day after it had cooled down, took it for another 20-mile drive, brought it back in. I aimed this gun at it. 261 degrees was the temperature of the rear end, which was hot. Let's face it, if I put a kettle with water, it would boil, right? 261 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a hot differential. And I thought I screwed up big time. But it turns out I didn't. And this is why I interrupted this video. What you need to know is that at the end of your rebuild, the differential is still going to get hot like heck. And that means what's going on is it's breaking in. The gears that are meshing only have a 10,000 backlash or gap. So they're meshing pretty tight. The whole thing is brand new, so all of the bearings, all the preload, and all of that is generating heat. Now, if you do take your car then for a run, don't go for more than 20 miles, don't tow anything, and be gentle, no jackrabbit starts, because what you're trying to do is just get the whole gearing and everything back and breaking in. So, 261 degrees, I looked it up on the internet, and sure enough, if you look below, anywhere in the 270 to 300 degrees is something you can expect from a brand new rebuilt rear end. So don't panic, right? Basically what's going on is the rear end needs to break in. Now I found another chart over here, and it talks about rear end temperature and oil life. So basically, if you run your rear end at 300 degrees, you're lucky if you're going to get 500 or even 1,000 miles out of that oil before that oil bakes up and is no good. You got to change it. So where I'm sitting right now, you can see I can go pretty good at, let's just say 270 or 260 degrees. But what I did do is I then waited the next day, took the car for a drive, brought the car back in, and I was already down into the 250s. So what's going on is the same distance. The overall temperature of the rear end wasn't as hot as the second time I took the car. Now, I have no idea what the temperature of the first time I took the car, because I said it was hot. It could have been in that 280 degree temperature. But now I've already got 60 miles on the rear end. I'm down, like I said, in the 240s, 250s, so the temperature's coming down every time I drive it, so it is breaking in, so everything seems to be okay. So basically the reason I interrupt the video is end result. Once you've rebuilt your rear end and you put it in the car, 20 miles max, 20 miles. And I would recommend driving with one of these in the car. And as you're breaking the rear end in and you've gone for a drive, and let's say you pull in for gas or you pull in for some pop or a coffee, a little shot, just take a look at the rear end, see what temperature it is. If it's anywhere near 300, which it's possible, if it's anywhere near 300, let the car relax, let it sit for a half an hour, let that temperature drop a bit, and once it's down into the 270s or something like that, off you go again, put another 5 or 10 miles on it. And that way there, you're gonna break it in slowly over time. So as I said, I've got 60 miles now on the rear end, my temperature is coming down. It looks like as I drop the temperature down, I get longer oil life, which is exactly, it makes sense. And I'm probably gonna change it once. So what's gonna happen in the next, let's say 200-300 miles once I'm done and the temperature is normal, and what I mean by normal is 200 or below or a little above, then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get a little pump the oil out, put some fresh oil in it, and then I should be good to go. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that service announcement. I'll let you get back to your regularly scheduled program. Okay, so we want to pull the axle shafts out of this car. So basically we have to remove the hubcap. There we go. And then the 5 nuts. Now, in order to pull this axle shaft out, we really need to apply pressure. So what we have is a slide hammer. So a slide hammer, quite literally, what it does is it locks on to the bolts, and then this weight draws the axle out. So what we're going to do is put it on. There we go. So the axle has been removed. So I'm just going to move these bolts, and then we can pull the axle out. So I just like to take a look at the axle shaft, make sure everything's okay. There don't seem to be any problems. Again, we just put this car together I guess the rear end we put about 1.5 years ago. Rear bearing is in good shape. There's no play whatsoever when I try to move the bearing. The retainer's on. Well, as promised, we're back under the car. Well, unfortunately, by removing those bolts on the shocks, you can see that gave me an extra inch. I mean, an inch is an inch, right? So I took the drive shaft off, obviously. Now what I did is I simply left the drive shaft in the car, as you can see here. And what I did is I put a screwdriver just to hold it up out of the way. The reason I'm doing that is I don't want to pull the yoke out of the back of the transmission, because we'll probably lose oil out of the transmission if we do that. So by leaving the drive shaft in place, it doesn't get in our way at all anyways. So there's the bolts, as I mentioned before. We have to remove the bolts around the outside. Simply removing all of the bolts all the way around the housing using a small screwdriver to start to break this seal, which I've done, obviously. I was just letting the last of the rear end oil into the pan. As soon as this stops dripping, I'm going to just take this whole assembly out and just drop it into the oil pan, and that way there I can slide the whole thing out. But basically, this is now going to pop forward, drop out, and the next thing is this piece will be on the bench. I'll see you then. Now I'm going to make sure I keep the orientation correctly. I want to make sure that this is left, this is right. So what we're going to do is pull these end caps, and then we'll be able to pull the crown out. Okay, so there's the ring gear, very easy to change. You pull the bolts and you change the gear. But we're not going to do that. We're actually going to change all the bearings, and we're going to clean this whole thing out and do an inspection, make sure everything's good, because this is the one thing I didn't do during the restoration, because I knew a gear set change was coming, so I didn't bother cracking this thing open. Okay, well, I'm not going to bore you. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to blow these bolts out. We're going to press these bearings off. I'm going to pull the pinion out of this thing. We're going to clean this whole thing up. I'll video it, but I won't be talking. It'll be in fast forward. And the next time I start talking is when we're going to start assembling it. I'll see you then. Okay, so just needed a couple of screwdrivers and just work my way out both sides here, and that just pops out. So you can take this out. It was a little hard to get it out inside the car or under the car because of simply that. Now, one spacer ring. Now again, I have a bunch of them. This is all going to do when we adjust the gap, but we'll take care of that later. I just wanted to show you something real quick. So this is a 273 pinion gear. You can see how massive this thing is. And you compare this now with a 350. You can see the huge size difference between the two. And this is all about that high-end gear ratio, right? This is where this only needs to turn 2.7 times in order to turn the rear wheels once, where this is going to have to turn 3.5 times to turn the rear wheels once. That means higher RPM here. But the idea is that means not only higher RPM to spin the wheels, but then gives you better hole shot, right? Because it's a better gear reduction on the rear end, so this car will take off out of the hole a lot quicker. And since I do have that fifth gear, which is a 0.68 overdrive, this smaller gear will have no problem, like I said, running highway 70 miles an hour. And as we showed on the calculator in the video earlier, this engine will run at 2100 RPM, 70 miles an hour, which for a small block is a good speed to spin. Okay, so now that we've cleaned up the pinion housing, what we want to do is press in the new bearing. So we place the bearing into the pinion, place it under the press. Now in this case though, I didn't throw away the old bearing that I had pushed out of this. So I'm going to use it inverted on top, and that'll then press directly onto the pinion. And then of course I've just got a block here that allows me to then put pressure directly onto the bearing. So what we're going to do now is simply apply pressure. It'll drive the second ring in, and then that one will just pop back out. And then as soon as I get a whole bunch of tonnage on the press, because the hydraulic press is giving me how much pressure it's putting on, as soon as it starts to get hard to push in, I know that that bearing is seated into the housing. So we just remove the pressure, and then we can pull this whole assembly apart. There we go. And what we've got is the new bearing is installed. What I also did is I put a little bit of oil in there just so that the bearing slides in a little bit easier, right? Because if it's a dry metal against metal, it'll always give you trouble. So now we got to flip it over and do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, as you know, we used an air gun to drive this nut down just to collapse that a little bit. So the first thing we want to do is, after we've done that, is to see and check if we have between 17 and 25 inch-pounds of force needed to turn the bearing. Now, as you can see, this moves way too easily. In fact, it's not even moving my inch gauge. And then the second thing is this. You can feel or hear that the bearing is still loose. So we have to tighten this down quite a bit. So I'm going to lock this in the vise, get the big breaker bar on this thing, and let's twist this nut about half a turn, and we'll check the whole thing again. So I gave the nut about a quarter turn, and now when I try to move it, well, at least the needle's moving now. So we've probably got about 10 inch-pounds of force needed to rotate the shaft. So like I said, 17 to 27, so we got to give this another quarter turn. That is getting hard to turn. I am using a very long bar on it. And again, I got a quarter turn out of it. I'm going to put the gauge on. There we go. That is moving now. I can rotate this. It's about 25 pounds, 26 pounds. That's well within the tolerance that we want. You also have to make sure to oil the seal, because if you don't oil the seal, that's going to add a little bit of resistance as well, and we don't want that to be part of the resistance of the issue here. So okay, so the pinion set is all done. We have about 18 inch-pounds of pressure to rotate this. And it just seems so hard to rotate. I'm so worried about the gears or the bearings, but I guess that's the load they're supposed to be under. I'm assuming that's so that there's a little bit of play and then eventually they wear in, but basically that just seems so hard to turn. But that is 17 pounds. It just, or 17 inch-pounds. It is just hard to turn. Okay, so I've already set the bearing into the end cap here, and I put a little bit of lubrication on it. Okay, so as I mentioned, the original one had a 0.5 thickness, 0.5 millimeter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the 0.5, and that's because basically we're just trying to keep this centered in the ring gear or in the crown gear. So in order to do that, assuming that this is now centered as compared to the other one, and the ring gear is the same diameter, 8 inches, I'm hoping that the 0.5 will work, but it's not going to really know for sure until what'll happen is we're going to have to take this and mark it with the yellow paint, and then once we mark it with the yellow paint, we'll be able to determine whether or not we need to move it forward or backwards. But for now, we're just going to start with the 0.5 and go from there. Okay, so I've put the pinion in now. I didn't put the new seal on, and the reason I haven't put the new seal on yet is because this is probably going to come in and out a few times, and I don't want to hurt the seal by constantly putting it in and out. So we'll just leave this out for now. And what'll happen is when this is finally ready to go, we'll put the seal in, we'll oil it up, and then we'll put this together, and then we'll torque these down. But right now, these are just put down in order to hold it. Okay, so this is how we disassembled the rear end. So we now have the orientation of the cap bolts and the caps on both sides. And what we're going to do is we're going to now take the carrier here, and we're going to install our crown gear. Now the crown gear comes with new bolts, and the reason it comes with new bolts is because the old bolts are actually shorter. You can see the difference between the two. There's quite a marked difference between the widths, because now this gear's got to move forward in order to engage this pinion, because as I said, the pinion's a lot smaller now. So we have a larger ring, which means we need longer bolts. So we have to make sure we do that. So let's get this installed. Okay, so the crown is on. 80 pounds of torque on the new bolts. I also put in the thread locker. Now the kit came with its own thread locker. To be honest with you, I didn't use it. I just used my thread locker. So like I said, no problem. So it's all torqued down. The last thing I'm going to do now, because I didn't want to damage them by putting the crown on first, the last thing I'm going to do is press the bearings onto the carrier here. Okay, like before, so I put the gear set back in, and this is the angle that we had. We have the two caps going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the one cap, put it in place. Now I'm only going to put this hand tight, just to hold the bearing in place. And then we're going to screw in. You do not want to have this in and then bolt this down, because you'll crush the threads. You want to put this down, like I said, hand tight, and then this will thread in. And then I'm just going to thread it in until it makes contact with the bearing. There we go. Now we'll do the other side, and then once we have the other side set, we can then actually start marking this with the yellow paint, and we can start taking a look at the pattern. Okay, so they're finger tight. I've got the caps in, they thread in nice and easily. So now what we can do is we can torque these down, because these aren't coming back out. I mean, all I can do with this now is move it left and right, and that's with the adjuster screws. And you can adjust these even though these are tapped down or torqued down. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull them out now that they're hand tight. We're going to apply some Loctite to them. I'm going to take them down to 85 pounds, which is the torque spec for this, well, 70 to 85. And then once we're down to torque, we can still make the adjustments left or right, but this assembly won't come out again. Now, we may have to pull the pinion assembly out and add spacers, but that doesn't affect the main crown gear. So we're just going to leave this in. So like I said, I'm now going to go back. I'm going to put in the Loctite. I'm going to tack these down to 80 pounds, 85 pounds, and then we'll be back. So as I said, I torqued down the end bolts. I have now taken these two adjusters and I have adjusted the carrier back and forth until I now have 9 thousandths back play, 9 thousandths. Now, the spec for this is between 8 and 12. So I think 9 is really good, considering that's probably going to wear a bit. So 9 thousandths back play. We've got these tightened down. We got the pinion in. What we're going to do now is put the yellow paint on, and we're going to take a look at the pattern, and then we'll have to adjust from there. Either we're going to have to bring the pinion in closer and then move the crown away, or we're going to have to pull the pinion out and move the crown closer. Again, it's going to depend on what the pattern looks like on the yellow paint. I'll see you there. Okay, so you can see that the wear pattern is actually quite low on the gear. It's not in the center up here, it's down here. So that means I'm going to have to put an additional spacer on the pinion gear to move it out or away from the ring gear, and that'll move it up. Okay, so we had gone the wrong way. I had put not only a 0.05 in here, I put another 0.25 in it, which brought me to 0.075, which is way too much, as we saw. We screwed up, we went the wrong way. So this now is a 0.025 spacer. And if we take a look at our wear patterns now, we can see that they are right in the center where we want them. So they're in the center of the crown. So that's a good wear pattern on that side. And if we switch over to this side, you can see that we have, for going backwards, we have a good pattern on it as well. It comes up on the side. So I think we've done it. What we do need to do, though, is we've got to pull this pinion one last time. I'll leave the spacer in, but I need to put the rubber seal in and put this together one last time, tighten it down, and then we can put this whole assembly back in the car. That was a bit of a trouble. Of course, we need to put the locks in, right? There's the locks that go in here to stop this from spinning. You don't want this moving anywhere now. And that'll be it. We'll put the rear end back in the car. Well, hopefully that helped. Like I said, it was mostly just to show you the steps needed to change the gearing out of the rear end, some of the things to look out for. The new gearings in the back of this car, it really works well now. I can put this car into overdrive and the RPMs drop nice and low, but it now starts really well. It pulls off the line really well with the 355s in the back of it. So like I said, I'm really happy with that decision. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that like button, and I'll see you under the car again.